The Battle of Yorktown was the last major fight in the Revolutionary War and took place mostly in October of 1781. What had happened is Lord Cornwallis, here leading his British army from Charleston in South Carolina, he wanted to link up with Sir Henry Clinton up in New York, but he was told to hunker down for a while in a place called Yorktown and fortified it. Upon hearing this, General Washington and French General Rochambeau decided to not attack New York City, of which they had superior numbers, and come down to take Yorktown because Rochambeau, seen here, thought it would be a much easier target to take. And so they were able to march down, leaving a little bit of a force up there. Help them out, the French fleet sailed up from the Caribbean and was able to engage Admiral Graves and the British fleet, which was protecting Yorktown. After the Battle of the Chesapeake, it saw that the French was victorious, and so it essentially left the British at Yorktown completely at the will of the French and Americans, who promptly moved in and surrounded Yorktown from all sides. Admiral Graves sent his fleet back up to New York City. They would get reinforcements, but it wouldn't be until the siege was over. Meanwhile, the British dug in. They retreated back from their defensive lines to just outside Yorktown. Here's the Hornwork, which is still used and was actually used during the Civil War, where Confederates occupied it. And this is where they would make their stand against French and American attacks. On the other side, not too far away, the French would create their large Grand Battery, where they had several cannons that would fire into the defensive lines and into Yorktown itself. The problem is that it took a while for all of this to get going, for all the lines and trenches to be built. Yorktown itself is not too far away from these lines. You could probably see somebody from a distance. Legend goes that George Washington himself fired the first big gun. There were little skirmishes, but he fired the big bombardment. And this bombardment lasted for several days before the French and American realized they need to get a little closer. They need to get within range of some of the smaller guns, I should say. So one night, Washington had his sappers go out at midnight to dig a completely new trench line closer to Yorktown. There was a diversionary attack seen to the left there by the French, and come morning, the British see that there's an entirely new defensive line that's only about 150 yards away from Yorktown. This was an absolute surprise and meant that now the French and American big guns can really bombard. You can see just how close they are to Yorktown defenses. There was one problem, though, is that off in the distance, this line was not totally complete. There were still a couple redoubts left under British control. This is redoubt number 9, I should say, and was held by Hessians, while redoubt number 10, closer to the York River, was held by British themselves. These redoubts had to be taken because they were physically in the way of the second Allied line. So once again, a night battle took place with a French diversionary attack in the north, and 2 targets were selected. Alexander Hamilton, seen here, would take redoubt number 10 along the York River. The idea was that you would do this during night. They wouldn't have any idea. They would be distracted by the attack in the north. His men had muskets unloaded, and the idea was to go around and make sure that the British could not retreat. And they were able to assault it. These are all depictions of it. There were about 400 men that went on the attack. There were about less than 100 of the British. The redoubt is taken and is quickly used by the Americans. Just to the left, redoubt number 9 was taken by the French. They had a bit more of a struggle. Again, they did not have their weapons loaded. But they were facing off against not British, but instead Hessians. These are German mercenaries that they had probably fought over in Europe at one point during the 18th century. But they did take some time getting them, but eventually the French were able to secure redoubt number 9. And immediately, both sides, both French and Americans, used these redoubts to extend their second assault line. You can see here, this is what the inside of the redoubt looks like. It's not terribly big, again, about 100 men inside. But the Americans would put big guns here and extend their defensive line, making it only a matter of time before Cornwallis would have to surrender, because he has no means of escape. So eventually, both sides started to communicate at the Morris Howe and worked out terms for surrender. The British wanted more pleasantries, but Washington denied them because they had been denied to the Americans when Charleston fell. The British were eventually, on the 19th, would come out, lay down their weapons, and march back. They would find themselves going back to New York City after they had surrendered and laid down their weapons. Many British were not too thrilled about this. This is the Red Surrender site as it is seen now, and is preserved. At the same time, there is a small French cemetery for the 60 French soldiers who died. They put up more troops and more weapons at the battle, arguably had more responsibilities during the battle, and so they are commemorated for what they were able to do. Now, at the surrender site, Lord Cornwallis was sick. He had malaria, as many British soldiers did at the time. And so he had his second, General Charles O'Hara, here surrender his sword first to Rochambeau, who then said, no, it needs to go to Washington. The British were able to send their fleet back to New York City, and it did not leave there. Back in England, Lord North knew that this was pretty much the end. He would go on to resign a year later, and a peace delegation started. You notice that there aren't any British in this delegation because they refused to sit for a portrait. Meanwhile, King George III, while not a fan of surrender, did realize that this was the most prudent thing to do. Today, now, there is a memorial. It was delayed for several years, but it finally commemorates the victory at Yorktown.